Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. This channel is dedicated to exploring critical issues in the world. This presentation is titled Africa Suffers from Internal Colonialism. This is a continuation of a previous presentation titled African Countries Are Not Independent States. This map shows the 54 countries of Africa. Most of them were established by European colonial powers. The purpose of this presentation is to achieve three goals. 1. To explore the issue of colonialism. 2. To determine whether Africa suffers from internal colonialism. And 3. If so, identify the factors which contribute to internal colonialism. To achieve the goals, the following arguments are made here. 1. Although almost all modern African countries claim to be sovereign states, after supposedly gaining political independence from their European colonial masters and are recognized as such under international law, they are not. This means that they are still under colonialism. 2. African countries are not sovereign states because European colonialism has been replaced by internal African colonialism. 3. In this regard, African nations are facing crisis of internal colonialism where the ruling elite, supported by their political parties, ethnic groups, and/or regions, and backed by their former colonial masters and some foreign powers, dominate and impose their will on other ethnic groups, regions, and citizens. And 4. Therefore, it is fallacious to refer to African countries as post-colonial states. The post-colonial era will come into being when current African nations are restructured or reorganized to reflect their African character as well as ensure democracy, equal representation, and fair distribution of political power and national resources. Likewise, internal colonialism will disappear when the current crop of rulers who are self-centered, short-sighted, manipulative, and exploitative are replaced by leaders who serve and listen to the people. Colonialism is defined as the process by which one nation controls the political and economic activities of another, less developed and less powerful society. For Africa, the consequence of colonization is that the African people are victims of a colonization complex as described by Robert Bluner. Colonialism can be broken into two. 1. External colonialism, and 2. Internal colonialism. It is necessary to discuss the characteristics of both forms of colonialism in order to fully comprehend the topic of discussion. Now, let's look at the characteristics of external colonialism. 1. When a foreign nation or state forcefully enters into the territory of another nation or state and dominates its population. 2. The forceful alteration or destruction of the indigenous culture and patterns of social organization by the invading state. 3. The domination of the indigenous population by representatives of the invading society. And 4. The justification of such activities with highly prejudicial, racist, ethnic, and political beliefs and stereotypes. Let's look at the characteristics of internal colonialism. 1. The desire of one individual or a group of individuals to impose themselves and dominate the rulership of the state. 2. The desire by one racial or ethnic or political or religious or regional group within a political community to control and dominate other groups within the community or state. 3. The alignment of the ruling elite, be it civilian or military, with external political entities like the former colonial masters and some foreign powers to direct the affairs of their countries and exploit their resources to the disadvantage of the citizens. 4. The unwillingness of the ruling elite to follow constitutional stipulations and the rule of law in making political and legal decisions. 5. The use of state institutions to stifle opposition and violate the constitutional, legal, and human rights of the citizens. 6. The unrestrained pilfering of public wealth to create private wealth by the ruling elite. In fact, many so-called millionaires in Africa acquire their wealth through pilfering from the state. 7. The unwillingness to use national wealth to institute social welfare programs including education, healthcare, health insurance, housing, retirement benefits, and employment that directly benefit the citizens. And 8. The lack of respect for the citizens by constantly lying, manipulating, propagandizing, and threatening to force the citizens to become submissive and helpless by the ruling elite. It should be noted that a theory of internal colonialism was developed by Black intellectuals to explain the Black experience in the United States. So therefore, internal colonialism is applied to Africa to explain the way the African ruling elite conspires with former colonial powers and other foreign interests to rule their countries dictatorially and exploitatively, thereby stifling the democratic and human rights of the people and impoverishing them through economic mismanagement and massive corruption. Now, how did Africa turn from external colonialism into internal colonialism? 1. It should be noted that almost all modern African countries, with the exception of a few, came into being through forceful incorporation by European military powers. 2. The European powers did not care about the needs, desires, and aspirations of the African people as they hurriedly created the colonies as agricultural and political plantations to boost their geopolitical and economic interests as they competed among themselves to dominate the world. 3. Thus, the territorial boundaries of the colonies were arbitrarily established based on military conquest without the slightest consideration of the ethnic nationalities which constituted the colonies. 4. Hence, some ethnic groups found themselves split into different colonies. There are many examples to cite from, but a few will do here. A. The Maasai are split into Tanzania and Kenya. B. The Tuaregs are split into Algeria, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, and Niger. C. The Somalis are located in Somalia, Somaliland, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti. D. The Akan people are found in Ghana and Ivory Coast. Those in Ghana speak English and those in Ivory Coast speak French. The Tutsis are found in Burundi and Rwanda with some elements that extends into Democratic Republic of the Congo and some probably in Uganda. F. The Berbers are in Algeria, Burkina Faso, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Morocco, Niger, and Tunisia. The Mandingo are found in Burkina Faso, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. H. The Oromo people are in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Djibouti. I. The Hausas are located in Cameroon, Chad, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and Sudan, and probably also in Benin and Togo. J. The Fulanis are found in Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Central African Republic, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, and possibly Sudan. K. The Mande are found in Burkina Faso, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Mali, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and possibly South Sudan. This is why when there is a conflict in one country, it expands into other countries because of the interethnic connections. Now, let's look at those who benefited from the external European colonial arrangement. 1. Those individuals who serve as warrant chiefs by working with the colonial authorities to consolidate colonialism. 2. Those ethnic groups which did not vigorously oppose the colonial system. 3. Those who joined the colonial police, paramilitary, and military forces to assist the external colonizers to consolidate colonial conquest. It should be noted that most of the police and military forces in Africa today originated from the colonial systems. Now, let's see those who did not benefit from the external colonial systems. 1. Individuals that vigorously opposed European colonization. 2. The ethnic groups that valiantly fought to stop European colonization of Africa. 3. Those with little or no Western and Islamic education. 4. The ethnic groups whose territories contain critical minerals and other natural resources. In other words, the more natural resources you have, the more you are marginalized. And 5. Those with socialist and communist ideological orientations. Now, let's look at those who benefited from the colonial arrangement after the supposed independence of the African colonies. 1. The educated, Christianized, and Islamized individuals, that is the nationalists, who had been socialized to embrace the cultural and intellectual values of the colonial powers. 2. The ethnic groups and regions of the nationalists who supposedly fought for independence. 3. the ethnic groups that worked cooperatively with the colonial powers to achieve their goals. 4. The colonial authorities handed over political power to the nationalists who had been socialized to embrace the cultures of the colonial masters. 5th, the ethnic groups and regions from which the nationalists originated became the most dominant political powers immediately after the supposed political independence of the African colonies. 6. The individuals and ethnic groups that opposed the colonial system were discriminated against, deprived, and marginalized in the so-called independent African states. So, why do we end up having the internal colonialists? Let's see the reasons. 1. Apparently, many nationalists who supposedly led the independence struggle became the new colonialists. 2. The ethnic, regional, and religious groups and political parties reinforced the dominant status of the nationalists by relegating other ethnic groups to subservient status in the so-called independent African colonies. 3. Many nationalists appointed mostly members of their ethnic, regional, and religious groups and political party associates to all important positions in the new independent states of Africa. Even today, the same still applies. That is why you have a lot of tribalism, regionalism in Africa. 4. Thus, the members of the politically dominant groups ended up controlling the economic nerve centers of the so-called independent states as they awarded government contracts to themselves and their associates. 5. The new African ruling elite, that is, those who became the political rulers and high government officials after independence, eventually dominated politically, economically, and militarily. And the marginalized and discriminated groups continue to suffer the way they suffer during external colonialism. In other words, the ethnic groups that were discriminated during the external colonialism continue to be discriminated under internal colonialism also. Just like the external colonialists, the internal colonialists and their associates or proxies started using derogatory terms to describe the deprived, discriminated, and marginalized ethnic groups and regions after they took over political power. Why are African rulers called internal colonialists? 1. As soon as the early nationalists gained political power from the external colonialists, most of them refused or failed to call for constitutional conferences that would have assisted immeasurably in reshaping the political configurations of the colonial arrangements. 2. They did not make any serious effort to call for a referendum or a plebiscite in order to determine whether the ethnic, tribal, regional, and religious groups which constituted their countries agreed to belong to the countries that the external colonial powers boxed them in. This is why in many parts of Africa you have conflict. 3. They did not make any major regional or continental effort to redraw the territorial boundaries to enable the states to be compatible with the ethnic, tribal, and regional characteristics in the continent. 4. They felt that the colonial powers handed over to them the authority to rule the African political entities, hence vigorously opposed any call for a constitutional conference or a referendum. They vigorously supported the colonial arrangement and used some of the repressive colonial laws to suppress those individuals and ethnic groups that calls for reorganization or reordering or rearrangement of the state. 5. Even in the 21st century, most African rulers continue to insist on perpetuating the colonial order, even though they are fully aware that the colonial arrangements were arbitrary and violated the natural rights of the African people to freely choose their political associations. 6. Even today, almost all over Africa, any individual or group that calls for a referendum or a constitutional rearrangement so that the rights of all citizens can be protected is treated as an enemy by African rulers who insist on maintaining the colonial arrangement. That is why today Nigeria is unstable. Senegal had gone through it before, and many other African countries, including Cameroon, have gone through it and continue to go through it because some ethnic groups insist that the systems must be rearranged. Why Africa suffers from internal colonialism? 1. The fact that European colonialists handed over political power to indigenous African rulers does not take away the fact that African rulers did not and have not effected any change to indicate political independence. 2. In other words, there is nothing to show that African countries have gained independence, apart from the fact that political control is now in the hands of internal colonialists who behave like external colonialists. And 3. The territorial boundaries of the countries remain exactly the way the external colonizers drew them. 4. The governments continue to mimic the governments in the homelands of the former colonial powers. There are many examples to cite from. For instance, A. Former French colonies continue to have governmental operations left behind by the French colonial authorities. In other words, the civil service in most Francophone countries is operated based on the French model. B. The same applies to former British colonies. Hence, the civil service in Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Malawi resembles the British model. C. The same applies to Portuguese and Spanish former colonies. 5. Many African countries continue to operate laws that the former colonial powers left behind. 6. The judiciary in African countries reflects the judicial systems in their former colonial masters' home countries. 7. The political party systems in Africa are carbon copies of the political party systems in the home countries of their former colonial masters. The exception is that African political parties operate like gangs with no ideological orientation. Why Africa suffers from internal colonialism? 8. Generally in Africa, the members of the ruling political parties are above the law, regardless of the crimes they commit. There are many examples to cite from. A. The members of the ruling parties are free to rig elections. In Nigeria, almost all elections at every political level are rigged. B. They use talks to intimidate members of the opposition parties. C. They can embezzle public funds with little or no consequence. D. On the other hand, the members of the opposition parties are treated as political enemies of the state. E. Members of the opposition parties are arrested for the slightest infringement of the law. F. They generally receive long-term sentences if found guilty in the courts of law. G. In particular, the ruling parties enjoy charging members of the opposition parties with crimes bordering on terrorism and national security. Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe was notorious for harassing the leaders of the opposition parties. Togo, Algeria, Tunisia, Nigeria, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Uganda, and so forth are other notable countries that intimidate the opposition constantly. H. The ruling political parties encourage the president for life syndrome by assisting the legislators to amend the constitutions of their countries so that their leaders can remain in power endlessly. The African landscape is filled with ruler for life political rulers who are protected by their political parties. I. African political parties do not believe in democracy since they perpetuate themselves in power endlessly. For instance, the Patriotic Front in Zimbabwe and the African National Congress in South Africa do not envisage allowing any other political party to rule. Togo and Equatorial Guinea do likewise. Egypt too does not encourage the opposition at all. 9. The educational systems in Africa continue to perpetuate and promote educational curricula that devalue African cultures and religions, even though the countries claim to be independent states. Therefore, African educational institutions continue to produce graduates who are alien to Africa but are socialized to embrace European and Arabic cultures, beliefs, values, and practices. African rulers do not see the strategic disadvantage in Africa to continue maintaining colonially induced educational systems that turn Africans into non-Africans. 10. Since the educational systems continue to turn Africans against themselves, it is not surprising that the ruling elite has no qualms about looting public funds and depositing such funds in foreign financial institutions. After all, the educational systems have socialized them to see Europe and Arabia and not Africa. Hence, they want to live like European and Arab rich barons. 11. There is always a disconnect between the African ruling elite who want to live like European aristocrats and the African masses. 12. Africa suffers from internal colonialism because the ruling elite hides under the banner of democracy to get into power. As soon as they grab power, they ignore democratic processes and rule dictatorially. Anyone who challenges them for wanting to remain in power for life are treated like enemies. As such, they are pursued, arrested, detained, beaten, tortured, and sometimes killed for opposing the ruler for life syndrome. 13. Africa suffers from internal colonialism in the sense that some African rulers are not satisfied with wanting to rule for life, but are grooming their children to take over the mantle of leadership from them when they pass away. In other words, in some African countries, political dynasties have been established as the children have taken over, such as in Chad, Gabon, and Togo. In some other countries, the children have been groomed but are only waiting like princes until the day their fathers vacate the throne so that they can take over. These are news reports about some of the corruption, the ruler for life things that are going on in the continent. 14. Even though almost all African countries that emerged from European colonialism are multi-ethnic and multi-religious in nature due to the arbitrary manner in which the colonies were created, yet most African rulers tend to rule these countries as if they are made up of only one ethnic group or one region and or one religion, thereby stifling the political rights and aspirations of many ethnic groups and regions. In other words, African rulers like the external colonialists have not acknowledged the fact that their political entities are multi-ethnic and multi-religious. Therefore, they must be sensitive to the needs of the various ethnic groups in their countries. As a result, they fail to design political systems that reflect the multidimensional nature of their countries. The failure breeds constant conflict and instability because many ethnic groups are not happy being placed in countries they do not want to belong. 15. Despite the multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of the African countries, the rulers remain in power as if they are kings and not as democratically elected heads of state. 16. When a particular ruler remains in power for 20 or more years, he or she discriminates against other individuals, ethnic groups, and regions, and that breeds conflict. The reason is that most African rulers tend to place most of their ethnic and regional members in high government positions, thereby causing discrimination against other ethnic groups and regions. Likewise, they reward excessively members of their families, ethnic groups, regions, political parties, and religions with contracts, financial grants, and influential government positions that enable them to dominate the entire country. There are many examples to cite from. A. Liberia for decades was politically, economically, and militarily dominated by members of a particular group against the interests of other ethnic groups. The imbalance led to the Sergeant Samuel Doe's bloody military coup and the resultant civil war in the country. B. The Ivory Coast was dominated by the Christian South, while the Islamic North felt discriminated when President Laurent Gbagbo and his party allegedly prevented Alassane Ouattara from competing for the presidency because he was alleged to be a foreigner. Northern Ivorian soldiers rebelled, and this led to a bloody civil war. See, surprisingly, Alassane Ouattara, whom northern soldiers fought for, has turned the table around. Having completed his term of office, instead of stepping down as promised, he decided to run again, thereby influencing political passion. Additionally, he too is trying to prevent former President Gbagbo from running for office by coming up with lame excuses to deny him the ability to contest the presidency. You see, it looks like African rulers don't learn from their past mistakes. In Kenya, Somalis in northern Kenya felt discriminated and marginalized to the point where many youths decided to join Al-Shabaab militant group to wage war against the country. Uganda is like broken glass since each individual that comes to power as a ruler wants to rule forever. Dr. Milton Obote ruled until he was forced out. General Idi Amin took power and ruled until he was forced out by force. President Yoweri Museveni continues to rule as a monarch. Hence, armed rebellions and conflicts are the only way to change regimes in the country. The Lost Resistance Army continues to be a shadow that reminds Ugandans that their fate hangs in the balance without taking into consideration the multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of the country. F. Suffocated by the self-centeredness of the ruling elite and their perennial desire to remain in power forever. A political crisis in Tunisia led to the Arab Spring, which engulfed North Africa and the Middle East. It was the Arab Spring that stopped the lifelong ambition of President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. The Arab uprising resulted in some leaders being forced out of power. G. It is amazing that the ruling elite in Cameroon continues to allow someone who needs to retire to continue to rule. President Paul Biya is 90 years old, yet he is still the president of an African country. 17. Africa suffers from internal colonialism because the ruling elite has little or no respect and regard for the citizens of their countries. The rulers do what they want to do and use the security forces to intimidate the citizens, not to challenge them. 18. The countries suffer from internal colonialism because the rulers are not transparent and accountable to the citizens. Hence, despite the numerous critical minerals in their countries, most citizens remain poor, while the ruling elite loots the wealth resulting from the exploration of minerals and natural resources. That is why the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is one of the richest part of the entire world, is also one of the poorest countries in the world. Is that not surprising? This data shows military coups in Africa over the decades. As you can see, the data started from 1950 and continued to 2000 1923. However, you can say that between 1960 and 2009 was the period where you had so many coups, and then the coups slanted downwards. Unfortunately, in West Africa, the coups are beginning to pick up again. This is a military coup in action. Now, let's look at coups in Africa and why coups are inevitable. Pretentiously, the African ruling elite shows displeasure whenever the military stages a coup to overthrow an existing regime. They condemn military incursion into politics and decry the destruction of the democratic process. They are joined by regional organizations like the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the African Union to condemn and institute sanctions against the military for scuttling democracy and violating the rights of the citizens to vote for who should rule them. As soon as the African rulers decry the military intrusion, the United Nations and other powerful democratic states join the chorus of condemnation against military coup in Africa. The condemnation of military coups is viewed as hypocrisy because the civilian ruling elite is mostly responsible for staging coups against the citizens of their countries. The so-called Democrats stage coups by amending the constitutions of their countries without the consent of their citizens and imposing ruler for life rulers on the people. Thus, whenever democratically elected political rulers refuse to hand over power and rig elections to remain in power, they stage a coup against the citizens. Therefore, Africa is characterized by rulers who remain in power endlessly against the wishes of the citizens. In Africa, there are two types of coups. One, military coup, and two, civilian coup. Let's look at the difference between the two of them. Military coup. This takes place when the military forcefully evicts an elected political ruler from office and takes over the administration of the state through military rule, like what is going on now in Niger, when the military kick out the democratically elected leader. Two, civilian coup. This takes place when an elected political ruler contravenes the constitutional limitation of terms of office and remains in power as if he or she is a monarch. A coup also takes place when a political party incessantly rigs elections to control political power. Also, a coup takes place when elected officials become authoritarian and use security forces to intimidate, detain, incarcerate, and even kill citizens for expressing their democratic rights. In fact, right now in Nigeria, the president head of state is in a kind of a limbo situation because so many Nigerians believe that he was rigged into power. You see? Unfortunately, a military takeover of power in Africa only provides temporary relief to the citizens. Sooner or later, they will begin to experience suppression of political rights, exploitation and corruption as senior military officers scramble to loot their own share of the public purse in order to enrich themselves. The reason the military does not necessarily bring change is that the officers are also the products of the same colonial educational system that devalues Africa and the African masses. Some of them, like politicians, are sponsored by foreign powers to stage military coups in order to perpetuate the status quo or bring a change that will favor the foreign interests. Some of the officers too want to amass wealth like their civilian counterparts, so they embezzle public funds. Some of them want to control the exploration and mining of critical minerals. For instance, the bloody civil war between the branches of the Sudanese armed forces is partially compelled by the need to control the mining of gold. In short, the military elite are not different from the political elite because they are all products of the same colonial system. Thus, like the civilian ruling elite, the military elite are also internal colonialists, with the exception of a few. Now, let's look at African poverty amidst plenty of resources. Ordinarily, Africa is one of the richest continents in the world. This implies that all African countries are supposed to be wealthy nations, and the citizens are supposed to have a high standard of living. Why? Because every African country has mineral resources that are more than sufficient to enable the citizens to be some of the richest people in the world. For instance, the Republic of Niger is always referred to as one of the poorest countries in Africa, even though it has cement, gold, uranium, coal, iron ore, tin, phosphate, petroleum, gypsum, and molybdenum. So why must Niger be a poor country with all that critical resources? Nigeria is today considered the world capital of poverty, even though it has so many minerals including talc, gypsum, iron ore, lead, zinc, barite, bentonite, bitumen, gold, coal, rock salt, gemstones, kaolin, petroleum, gas, and so on and so forth. Why should Nigeria be a poor country? Why should Nigerians suffer? The Democratic Republic of the Congo has bauxite, beryl, cadmium, cassiterite, coal, cobalt, copper, diamond, gases, germanium, gold, manganese, methane, palladium, platinum, uranium, wolframite, and so on and so forth. Yet, the DRC is in abject poverty. Why? South Sudan has 16 minerals including bauxite, cement, copper, diamonds, dolomite, gold, iron ore, lead, manganese, marble, petroleum, rare earth, uranium, zinc, and so forth and so on. However, the political rulers who could be referred to as gladiators have not been able to reconcile their differences. Hence, from the time the country gained independence, they have been fighting each other, so the citizens cannot benefit from the wealth of their land. Algeria has barite, bentonite, copper, diamonds, gold, iron ore, lead, manganese, marble, petroleum, phosphate, uranium, wolframite, zinc, and so on and so forth. Zambia has beryllium, coal, cobalt, copper, emeralds, gold, iron ore, limestone, manganese, myriad gemstones, steel, sulfur, uranium, zinc, and other critical metals. Why should Zambia be a poor country? Thus, no African supposed to be poor. The only explanation is that the minerals are exploited by the rulers in collaboration with foreign countries and companies. This is why the citizens remain poor, because they are not getting some of the benefits of their resources. Corruption in Nigeria. Look at this. It is estimated that Nigeria lost more than $400 billion to oil thieves since 1960. This could have hired over 494,000 primary school teachers. If African ruling elite are not internal colonialists, they would have utilized their citizens to explore these vast minerals and use the financial proceeds to build the infrastructure, develop and modernize the economy, build schools, public housing, modern healthcare facilities, create social welfare programs, and tremendously enhance the quality of life of their citizens. Unfortunately, African ruling elites, both civilian and military, are only interested in what they can get for themselves. So they give away all the minerals almost free and end up with 5 or 10% of the accruable revenue. Instead of recruiting and mobilizing their people to develop their countries, they roam the world searching for foreign countries that will come to assist them to develop. It is commonly expressed in diplomatic circles that African rulers and high government officials are the easiest public officials to negotiate with in the world, because many of these officials only look after their personal interests. They don't care about their countries. You see, the reason is that the officials are always begging for what can benefit them personally without caring about the strategic interests of their countries and their citizens. This is why the richest continent also becomes the poorest continent. Conclusion: in Africa, the early African nationalists fought the colonial powers to supposedly gain independence. As soon as they gained freedom, they started to behave like the colonial masters and impose their will on the people. They even adopted repressive colonial laws to stifle dissent. Like African politicians, African military coup plotters behave similarly by doing exactly those things they promise not to do after taking over political power. Generally, soldiers justify the need to overthrow an existing regime with a promise to do better, only to behave like the leaders of the regime that they overthrew. In some cases, they behave even worse than the previous leaders. Regardless of whether the ruling elites are members of the political class or military officers, the result is the same. As soon as they get into power, they forget the citizens and treat them distastefully as if the citizens are colonial subjects. They violate the national constitutions and laws with impunity. They convert public funds into private funds and deposit the funds in the home countries of their former colonial masters. They collaborate with foreign countries and foreign companies to exploit the mineral resources and render the people poor and helpless. The rulers send all their children to attend higher educational institutions overseas, thereby implying that they do not care about the feelings of those citizens whose children must attend universities at home. They refuse to build modern healthcare facilities while they receive medical treatment overseas, paid for by the people. The security forces, that is the police, army, intelligence, navy, air force, and so forth, are used mostly to protect the members of the ruling elite and their families, and not the citizens. Even though the ruling elite know clearly that the present countries were created arbitrarily by foreign powers, they refuse to allow any kind of a negotiated rearrangement or restructuring of the countries to reflect Africa. Those ethnic and regional groups that call for constitutional conferences or referendums to decide the fate of their colonially induced countries are viewed as enemies, and the security forces are sent to crush them. The pent-up frustration leads to all kinds of conflicts in the continent. Yes, African rulers today are working hard to build the infrastructure and the economy in preparation for industrial takeoff. Yes, some of them are speaking more forcefully. However, these physical developmental efforts are like castles built on flimsy foundations. The reason is that without first resolving the fundamental political issues dealing with territoriality, constitutionality, and the sharing of the national wealth in a manner that benefit the constituent parts that were forced into these countries, peace can never take place in the continent. As a result, any African country can explode at any time in conflict, regardless of the building of modern cities, the building of the infrastructures, and the economy. In fact, Sudan provides an excellent template where two top generals decided to go on a war path because they are scrambling to be in control of the state. That means there is no regard for the institutions of government, and there is no regard for governance. Indeed, Africa suffers from internal colonialism, and the ruling elites are internal colonialists. Why? They took power from the external colonialists and refused to make amends in order to create a true sense of independence. The continent is suffering from internal colonialism due to the destructive behavior of some of the rulers. Moreover, many African rulers rely on former colonial masters and foreign powers to guide and protect them as they inflict unbelievable pain and suffering on their citizens while transferring the wealth of the continent into secret bank accounts overseas. This is why Africa is the richest and the poorest continent. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please subscribe to this channel to listen to other interesting presentations. Again, thank you.